Hi guys, Arvel from Pixel Party here, and today I'd like to show you a new application for event triggering. So this is an application called Trigger that will allow you to trigger 256 events either by time, a timer, or by time code. You can go between triggers by either using the trigger select right here or by just clicking the number down below. Notice how the trigger select will update if you click on the feedback numbers below. So let's create a trigger. First thing we need to do is give this a name. So let's call this layer 3 opacity. And if I want to be able to find it down here in this list of triggers a lot quicker, you can even click the label name and assign this a color. And now notice that trigger 1 is also matched the color of whatever the label color is as well. Next thing we need to do is go ahead and assign trigger values. So if we click on trigger, here we can specify when we want this trigger to occur by selecting an hour, minute, and second. If we want to trigger it off the time of day, for example, this would be 12:056. This also uses a 24-hour time code. So for example, let's put this to 12:1 and then let's set this to 20. Next we'll need to specify how we want this trigger to listen. We want to listen from the time, so if we click on time, we're now feeding this from the time. So as soon as this hits 20, notice that our feedback indicator shows that triggered. If we want to change this to the timer, we can hit timer 0, 0, and let's start this at 5 seconds. Up here we can specify how long we want this timer to play for, so hour, minute, second. Let's set this to, we'll keep that at 10 seconds. We can also have this timer repeat whenever it's finished, or it can just run once and stop. So if I hit start, we are counting up, and when that hits 5, it should trigger right there. And we have repeat turned on, so as soon as it hits 10, it's going to restart again. Alright, and lastly we have time code. If we hit time code, it also enables your frames. And there's a couple different ways that Trigger works with time code. If we go to our settings tab down here, right now our time code source is internal, which is Trigger. So Trigger is actually generating the time code, and you can specify at what sample rate it's triggering there, or it's generating. And then up here you can specify the frame rate of which the time code is being generated at as well. So keeping this, let's just go down to 3 seconds on this one, and we have time code selected here. So if you hit start, as soon as our seconds hits 3, it should trigger. There it is. And reset. Alright, so for the rest of this example, I'm just going to keep this on timer. And we'll do the timer for 6 seconds, and we'll start this at 1 second. Down below, we have our off value, our fade in time, our on value, and fade out time, and then finally we have our hold. So this will tell your output devices what value you want it to be when trigger is not turned on. So right now we have that set to 0%. We want this to fade in from 0 to our on value, which is set to 100 in 0 seconds. So that's just going to snap right into place. And then it's going to fade out back to 0 in 0 seconds. The trigger is going to be held for a duration of 1 second. Later on we will change the values of the fade, and we can preview what that's doing in real time. Moving on, we have our output assignments. So that's going to be OSC and DMX. By default everything's turned off, so let's go ahead and turn this on. So now we are outputting a OSC float, and we're broadcasting that to all IP addresses. If we change this to a specific IP, we're only going to be outputting OSC to that address. And then you have your OSC output port, and then we have our OSC address. So for this example, let's pull up Resolume, and we will go to Shortcuts, Edit OSC. We're going to click on Layer 3, and we're going to copy this top line right here. In Resolume, there's two different ways to trigger this. Don't try selecting all of that. Just pick one or the other. So this right here says it is a float 0 to 1. So if we come back to trigger and we paste this in, if we go back up to our trigger, we are now going to have that fader set to 0 when it's off, and it's going to go to 100% when it's turned on. We have this set to repeat every 6 seconds, triggering on the first second and holding. So if we hit start and then go back to Resolume, we should see this trigger every 5 seconds. There it is. Alright, so let's go into this fade in. So let's say we want this to fade in for 1 second, and then we want to have that fade out also to 1 second. This will smooth the transition. But notice here that our hold time is only 1 second. So this is 1 second, 2 seconds. So we need to bump this up to at least 3. I'm going to put this on 4. That way it fades in on a second. It'll hold for 4 seconds and then fade out. And if we go back here, we can now see that that is a nice smooth transition, and it's not going to be a hard snap or a hard jump. It fades in and fades out nice and smoothly. So let's go ahead and put these fades back to 0. And let's have our hold for 2 seconds on this one. So going back to OSC, we also have this Resolume failsafe. And what that does is, let's throw a clip in here. Let's do the old American flag. And if you click over here on the clip selection of the American flag, or of your clip, it shows your transport set to timeline. I've had a few tours where we were triggering clips using a timecode offset. So for this example, let's go ahead and open up our OSC by going to OSC edit, or Shortcuts, Edit OSC. Click on this specific clip. I'm going to copy that, so we are now triggering this clip. Alright, and for this example we are going to use timecode. So we only need that to trigger for 1 second. Let's set that to timecode, and it's going to trigger on the first second. A few more things we need to do to get this example working is we're going to go down to our settings, and I guess this would be a good time to just go over all the settings. Up at the top we have our IO viewer, so this is showing what is going out of trigger. So right now we're viewing OSC, so it's saying the label we gave it, layer 3 opacity, is now outputting this. Let's go back and rename that to flag trigger. So now we see that our flag trigger is going to be going to this OSC address, and that's the current value of it. If we click on DMX, it'll show the DMX outputs if we assign it at that point. DMX out address is the same thing as the OSC addresses. You can send all your DMX to a specific IP or broadcast it. Your local out network adapter, by default that's just left blank, but if you have multiple adapters, you can assign a specific adapter to trigger. Down below we have our timecode source. Right now it's being generated within trigger. If we click on that, we are now getting timecode externally, which you now notice we have a new feature. Since we're no longer generating, we are getting it from audio in. So if we hit on, we are now looking for our audio in devices. If it's mono or stereo, what channel if it is on stereo, what the sample rate is, and your buffer. And then we have our audio out device. So if you hit on that, I'm going to be outputting on a virtual input. You have your buffer, your volume level, and your panning. So going back to Resolume, I want to go to my audio settings, and my input is that virtual device that I just selected in trigger. And then I have my timecodes configured down below. And as you notice, we are getting a little bit of jumping, which means we are connected. So now I want this clip to follow this playhead. So if I hit SMPTE1, notice it's not playing, but as soon as we go into trigger and hit play, the playhead is now following our timecode coming from trigger. So if I close out of this, right now we don't have any clips selected. And if we come back to trigger, we hit reset. Let's kind of put this over here. Right now we should trigger that clip 1 second in. So if we hit start, this is LSC. Okay. So that did trigger this clip right here. But what the failsafe does is if that's turned on, at any point if we lose timecode, so we hit stop, it automatically changes that clip to timeline mode. If we didn't have that turned on, we reset this. Let's put back onto SMPTE. What would happen is we hit start, so the clip's playing, but if this timecode stops, your video clip is frozen in place. That's not always the best solution for a show, at least in my experience. So what we'll do again on this is it's playing right now, and with failsafe turned on, if this stops, notice right here it's going to go from SMPTE to timecode or timeline. And then if we get our signal back, it'll jump right back to it. I guess another example for this would be to just turn off our output. So if we turn that off, on, off, on. A scenario where this would come in handy is if your timecode audio device keeps dropping signal. This is a good way to have that just automatically switch into timeline mode, so your clip continues to play even without timecode. In my experience, that's better than it having just stopping completely. Below that, you can choose what you want it to failsafe to from 1 to 2, so you're selecting back and forth if you're reading from timecode 1 or if you're reading from timecode number 2. Another thing I do want to mention on this is the time of day is actually driven by your system clock down here. So if we change this manually, let's say we make that 2, we hit change, notice how that updates right here as well. So that is where trigger is getting its time of day from. Okay. And then one other thing in the OSC section is if we change this to integer, notice we get a few more options here. a few items will have integer values. So if we go back to our shortcuts, edit OSC, and let's click on our blend mode. Notice how if we go from a fader right here, it goes float 0 to 1. If we click on certain items such as like blend mode, it's going to be integer 0 through 59. So we'll copy this address right here, come back into trigger, paste that. Then we'll set our off value from 0 to 59. I have noticed for this particular OSC, I have to set it to 1, not 0. Not sure why. So right now we have our range, instead of being from 0 to 1, it's now 0 to 59. If we go back to our trigger and we put this back on timer mode, if we go from 0 to 100, we are now going from 1 to 59. It's remapping our min and max values. So let's go ahead and start this. We should see that go from 0 to 50 to lighten. So here we go, we see it going from 50% add to white, back and forth. And if we come back to the trigger here, if we move this down from 100% maybe to 50, we're going to go halfway through this list, which is Luma key. There we are. So that was what the integer option is going to do. Notice if we put this back to float, it's not actually going to do anything because it is listening for a integer value, not a float value. Alright, so up next we have our DMX output. This is going to be very similar to the OSC. Right now we have it set to net 0, subnet 0, universe 0, channel 1. So if we go into arenas preferences for DMX, we have subnet 0, universe 0, and let's go ahead and assign channel 1. So we'll hit shortcuts, edit DMX. Let's do our layer 1 opacity fader. So we'll right click and hit create DMX shortcut, channel 1, and we want our Lumiverse to be 1. And we'll keep our range from 0 to 1. Coming back up to trigger, if we turn this on, we should see this trigger whenever trigger triggers. There we are. And if we go back to our trigger and we increase our hold time to, let's say, 4 seconds, and then our fade to be 1 and 1. It should have a nice smooth fade in and nice smooth fade out. If we go back to our settings, we can see that we are getting an output on OSC, and we are now getting it on DMX as well. Let's go ahead and we will turn our trigger off, that way it's not triggering at all. And one last thing I kind of wanted to go over on this is over here we have a manual trigger section. So what we can do, let's go ahead and assign our OSC to be channel 2 fader. Hit OSC. There we are. What we can do is we can test this without even using the trigger manually, just to make sure all of our assignments are done correctly. Right now it's set to a momentary button, so if I hit go, both layer 1 and 2 should jump up because layer 2 is being controlled by OSC, which is still turned on, and then DMX is being controlled to layer 1 because it is turned on. So if I hit go, it fades in. I'm still holding the button down so the trigger's still on. If I let go, it's going to come down. If I go back to our trigger and we turn these fade times to 0, and we do this again, if we hit latch, it's going to hold that button on until we hit it again. And then if we hit slider, we can manually raise this up just a little bit, just as if we were doing it inside of the Resolute UI. So this is a good way just to test out your trigger and make sure your DMX and your OSC has been assigned properly. And just like all my other apps, if you click on this little help button at the bottom, it'll turn labels orange. If you click on them, it will tell you exactly what that parameter does. The last thing to go over is we have a reset button down at the bottom. This will reset all of your triggers. So if you want to start fresh, just hit reset and everything will get reset at that point. So be very careful on using that if you have multiple things set up. Another thing you can do is if you hit Control-Shift-S, it will pull up a Save As window for you. So if you have multiple shows that need to have different triggers, you can save this instance for that show name and then go ahead and open up your trigger app again and it should start fresh. This way you can have multiple setups for different shows. At the bottom here we have a save. This will overwrite the default trigger app. You can always hit save, reset save, and it takes it right back to where it started. At the bottom here, if you hit bypass DMX or OSC, it will bypass all the DMX and all the OSC for all triggers. And I believe that is everything for trigger. Give it a shot. Let me know what you think. Thank you guys.